Hi, I'm Karen Sherry. I'm a curator here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I was also the curator of the Determined exhibition. This exhibition, which is titled Determined, the 400-Year Struggle for Black Equality, explores Black history in Virginia from 1619, which was the date of the arrival of the first captive Africans on Virginia's shores, up through the present day. And this is 4 centuries of history that is marked by racism and discrimination and oppression of Black people, but it is also marked by their fight for freedom and equality and civil rights and equity in American society. So it's really a tale of determination and perseverance, strength, and resilience. It's also a story that showcases how profoundly Black Americans have shaped American history and have shaped our nation's highest ideals, what it means to be a democracy, what equality means in our society. The Determined exhibition is organized chronologically into 4 chronological sections, and this first section covers the colonial period from 1619 through 1775. That was a period that witnessed Virginia evolve from what was a fledgling, barely surviving colony on the outpost of the British Empire to what became the most economically profitable and one of the most powerful colonies in the British Empire. And that transformation was fueled by 2 intertwined developments: the growth of tobacco, which was a labor-intensive crop, which required lots of laborers. So the second development was the growth and institutionalization of a system of slavery which relied on enslaved African labor. One of the individuals featured in this colonial section is a woman named Angela. We know very little about her. Her name only appears twice in the historical records, but we do know that she was one of the first captives who was brought to Virginia's shores by force in 1619. She likely came from the Ndongo Kingdom of West Africa, where she was kidnapped. That region was subjected to regular raids by Portuguese slavers and their allies. So Angela was kidnapped, she was taken to the coast, put upon a Portuguese slaving ship that was bound for Mexico. But en route over the Atlantic during what was undoubtedly a horrific Middle Passage, that Portuguese ship was attacked by 2 British pirates who kidnapped about 50 of the enslaved Africans and then made way to Virginia, arriving in Old Port Comfort, present-day Hampton, in 1619. We do know that in 1625, Angela was living in the household of Captain William Pierce, who was one of the leading figures in colonial Jamestown, and she likely used items like these in her daily life in William Pierce's household. These are items that were excavated from other 17th century Virginia plantations. They include a cooking pot and a hoe blade, so she likely helped with the gardening, with the cooking, and other household tasks. We also have this really extraordinary gourd fiddle. It dates from the 19th century, but it's an important artifact that underscores how profoundly African culture influenced American culture. The captive Africans who were victims of the international slave trade, they generally didn't bring their material possessions with them to the Americas, but what they did bring was their cultural traditions, their religions, their foodways, their languages, their musical practices. And this gourd fiddle is based on a type of instrument that had been made in West African cultures for centuries and centuries. And it's an instrument that influenced the development of the banjo, what we think of as a quintessentially American musical form. Other individuals featured in this exhibition include Bambara Harry and Dinah. We don't know much about them except that they were held by Robert King Carter. King was his nickname, and it was an apt one because Robert Carter was the largest and one of the most powerful planters in colonial Virginia. He amassed huge holdings of plantations that included more than 40 properties and more than 700 enslaved people. Bambara Harry and Dinah were two of those enslaved people who we believe tried to run away because in 1708, King Carter got permission from the Virginia courts to cut off their toes. He refers to Bambara Harry and Dinah in those court records as incorrigible. This probably means that they tried to run away because cutting off toes or other forms of physical dismemberment were common punishments for attempting to run away in the colonial period. That underscores how harsh the system of slavery was, how brutal some of the punishments were. Yet, I think it's also an important indicator of how strong the desire for freedom was for Bambara Harry and Dinah. They were willing to risk that kind of horrific, brutal punishment in order to gain their freedom. One of the artifacts that is displayed with their case is the inventory of Robert King Carter's estate. This was made in 1733, the year after his death, and it lists all of his assets, which included his more than 40 plantations and his more than 700 enslaved individuals. And I hope you can see how his, quote, assets, unquote, are listed. First, his Negroes by plantation, then right under that, his horses, his hogs, his cattle, and then his other physical possessions like furniture and so forth. And this shows how in colonial Virginia, actually throughout the period of slavery, enslaved people were legally considered property. They were counted the same as other physical assets like cattle, like furniture, and so forth. In the next chronological section of Determined, we cover the period from the American Revolution, beginning in 1775. That was the war in which America gained its independence from Britain and established itself as an independent nation, the United States of America, through the Civil War, which is the war that nearly tore the country apart, yet ultimately ended 246 years of slavery in the United States. And during the century that's bracketed by these two wars, we see the nation becoming increasingly fractured over the issue of slavery. While slavery is abolished on a gradual basis in all the northern states, it becomes ever more deeply entrenched in the South, and debates about whether slavery should exist, whether it should expand into new territories as the United States expands westward and southward. Those debates become increasingly contentious, ultimately erupting in the Civil War. One of the really extraordinary figures, one of many featured in Determined, is a woman named Jane Minor. And you may have never heard of her, but she has a pretty remarkable story. Jane Minor began her life in slavery, but she earned her freedom in 1824. She nursed the citizens of Petersburg through an influenza. And because of her selfless devotion to caring for both white and Black citizens, she was given her freedom. Now, this talented nurse and healer, she continued to practice nursing in freedom, yet she also used her earnings to become an emancipator. Jane Minor freed 16 women and children in Petersburg. And we have some reproductions of those documents of her emancipating some women and children. And that was generally a two-step process. She would first purchase the enslaved person, and then she would manumit them, give them their freedom. One of the women she freed was a woman named Phoebe Jackson. And we believe that Jane Minor also taught Phoebe Jackson the nursing arts, because Phoebe Jackson practiced as a nurse in Petersburg as well. And it's an important reminder that there were free Black people in the South before the Civil War, and there were relatively large and vibrant communities, especially in bigger cities like Petersburg and Richmond. Now, one of the really remarkable documents we have in the exhibition is this medical account book that Phoebe Jackson kept. and it tracks the various treatments she provided. She lists the treatments, the amount she charged, and then she marks the account as paid. And if you look closely at this document, you'll see that many of her treatments involved some kind of bleeding. Cupping, leeching, and other bleeding forms were pretty common standard medical practices through the middle decades of the 19th century. Throughout the period of slavery, Black Virginians rebelled against their enslavement in various ways, including sometimes trying to lead a rebellion. Now, you may have heard of Nat Turner's revolt in 1831 or John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, but you may not know about Madison Washington's revolt aboard the Creole. And that's surprising because Madison Washington led the single most slave revolt in U.S. history in 1841. Now, Madison Washington was an enslaved man who was sold in the slave market in Richmond, put aboard a ship called the Creole, which was bound for the slave market in New Orleans. On board that ship, as they were traveling to New Orleans, Madison Washington led 18 other enslaved men. They broke out of the cargo and commandeered the ship. They then had the Creole sail to the Bahamas. Now, the Bahamas was part of the British territories at that time. And Madison Washington and his cohorts knew that slavery had been abolished in British territories and that if they got to British soil, they had a good chance of gaining their freedom. And indeed, that was the case. Even though this Creole incident created a huge international incident between Britain and the US, ultimately, almost all of the 135 enslaved people who were on board the Creole earned their freedom, including Madison Washington. And one of the artifacts we have relating to his story is this marlin spike. This is a nautical tool that's used to work the knots on board a ship. Now, when Madison Washington and his collaborators broke out of the hold, they had to improvise for weapons, so they probably grabbed whatever was at hand, including things like marlin spikes. Even though they rebelled and took over the ship, it was ultimately a revolt that resulted in very little loss of life. Only one of the white crew members aboard the ship lost his life. Another one of the chronological sections in the Determined exhibition covers the period from Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, through World War II. And this is a period that was very much marked by the kind of push and pull dynamic of progress and regress for Black Virginians. On one hand, many Black Americans were embracing the promises of freedom and citizenship, the new opportunities they had in education, in creating their own businesses, in building vibrant Black communities. Yet, on the other hand, we also see the white establishment start to react against that progress and try to reinstitute white supremacy, primarily through practices such as the disenfranchisement of Black men who gained the right to vote through the 15th Amendment of 1870, also through the system of Jim Crow segregation, and through other forms of racist intimidation and violence. John Mitchell is one of the featured individuals who very much embodies this dynamic of progress and backlash in the period. He was one of the leading civic figures in Richmond's Jackson Ward neighborhood, which was a vibrant Black community, one of the most vibrant ones in the South. It was actually referred to as the Black Wall Street because of the large number of Black-owned businesses. Mitchell himself was an entrepreneur, he was a civic leader, but he's perhaps best known for his long editorship of the Richmond Planet, which was one of the nation's leading Black newspapers. John Mitchell, as the editor of that paper for more than 40 years, earned the nickname the Fightin' Editor for his very fiery rhetoric. He was known as an outspoken advocate of Black civil rights, of race pride, and of racial equality. Now, that kind of position frequently made him the target of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And we have an example of the KKK hood from 1920. And it's interesting to look at the history of such groups like white supremacists. They often surge in times of Black progress. So we see the KKK formed after the Civil War. It surges in the early decades of the 19th century when many Black communities were making progress. It surged during the Civil Rights Movement, and then again, more recently, after the election of the nation's first Black president. So if this KKK hood represents kind of the backlash against Black progress by white supremacists, this really beautiful and ornate helmet marks the progress. This is a helmet that was part of the regalia of the Colored Knights of Pythias. That was a Black fraternal organization that provided not only social camaraderie for the members, but also provided services like insurance and death benefits and so forth. And those kinds of services were really important because under the Jim Crow era, under the era of segregation, many white establishments would not provide those kinds of services to Black individuals. John Mitchell was a leading member of the Colored Knights of Pythias, and those members would wear helmets like this as part of their fancy regalia. And they wore those both during their secret ceremonies and also in public parades they had down the streets of Jackson Ward and other cities. Clemenceau Givens, who is a native of Richmond, very much marks the contradiction of American society as it was entering World War II. On one hand, the nation was asking all Americans, including Black citizens, to fight and support the war effort, to fight against totalitarian regimes abroad. At the same time, America was treating its Black citizens as second-class citizens. It was subjecting them to legalized segregation and other iniquities. And that contradiction is embodied by the notion of a double victory, which was the name given to civil rights activism of the period around World War II. And double V, or double victory, referred to the idea that Black Americans had to fight for victory both against discrimination and oppression at home, as well as against fascist regimes abroad. Now, that burgeoning civil rights activism prompted the U.S. military to create the Tuskegee Airmen Program. Now, through World War II, like much of American society, the military was segregated, and Black service people were generally relegated to menial jobs. They were given leadership positions and so forth. Well, Black activism around that matter finally prompted President Franklin Roosevelt to create the Tuskegee Airmen Program to train Black fighter pilots. That's a program that ultimately trained about 1,000 Black pilots, as well as nearly 15,000 additional service people, men and women who worked as mechanics, as radio operators, as bombardiers, and so forth. Clemenceau Givens was one of those pilots. He was stationed in southern Italy, and he made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. He was killed when his plane went down while flying over the coast of Italy in 1944. And we have what's a really poignant document, this Western Union telegram that the military sent to Clemenceau Givens' family here in Richmond, notifying them of his death. We also have two really fabulous costume items. One, a leather flight helmet and goggles. This was a standard issue for Tuskegee Airmen. And then we also have the bomber jacket that was worn by a Tuskegee Airman from
Portsmouth, a man named Thomas Winburn, who trained to be a bombardier. And if you look closely at his patch, you'll see the patch on his jacket gives his nickname of Windy, and also shows Bugs Bunny leaning back on a missile, chewing on a carrot and saying, "What's up, Doc?"
The last chronological section in Determine covers the period from the 1950s and the modern civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s through the present day. This is a period that witnessed the massive uprising for Black civil rights of the 1950s and 60s, protests and other actions that ultimately resulted in landmark legislation, civil rights legislation in the 1960s that fundamentally changed the nature of American democracy by barring discrimination on the basis of race. And we see throughout the rest of the period, Black Virginians making incredible progress and incredible accomplishments in all arenas of American life, from sports to culture to politics to science and so forth. This section brings us up to the present day, where on one hand, we can see the incredible progress we've made as a society towards our ideal of universal equality, yet we still have to recognize that we're a society that struggles with a long legacy of race-based discrimination and oppression. We're still contending with systemic racism throughout American society, various forms of iniquities in our justice system and socioeconomic status and so forth. So we still have a lot of work to do to fulfill that ideal of universal equality, but we have made progress. One of the leading figures of the civil rights movement was Dr. Wyatt Walker, who began his career in Virginia. He was a theology student at Virginia Union University in the early 1950s, and it was there that he met Dr. Martin Luther King. They forged a lifelong friendship. Walker went on to serve as a pastor at Gilfield Baptist Church in Petersburg, and it was from there that he really began his career as a civil rights leader. He used to advocate for various protest actions from his pulpit using his congregation. And he went on to become a right-hand man to Dr. Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. King, in fact, referred to Dr. Walker as one of the keenest minds of the civil rights movement, because Walker really was the primary strategic thinker behind ideas of massive protests. He planned the Birmingham campaign of 1963, the March on Washington of 1963, and so forth. He was really a leading figure in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that he helped found with Dr. King. Some of the items we have related to Dr. Walker's career as a civil rights activist include this. It's a very humble looking book, but it is from one of his early protest actions. In 1960, Dr. Walker led a group of people, Black people, to the whites only section of the Petersburg Public Library. And Dr. Walker tried to check out this book. Now, in a kind of humorous bit of irony, this book is a biography of Robert E. Lee. I think shows a little bit of Walker's sense of humor. Walker was denied access to this book. The librarian immediately picked up the phone, called the police, and it was the first of many arrests that Walker was subjected to for his civil rights activism. We also have a letter sent to Dr. Walker from Dr. King. And this letter is from 1958, and it references a protest against school segregation that Dr. Walker was leading in Richmond. What's interesting about this letter is you see it's addressed Dear T and signed yours very truly, Mike. Only Dr. King's closest friends called him Mike. One of the figures in Determined who very much underscores not only the achievements of Black Virginians, but also the ways in which their stories have often been hidden to history or often have been under-acknowledged until recently. And that figure is Dr. Gladys West. Now, if you ever use GPS navigation on your cell phone or in your car, you have to thank Gladys West, because she was a mathematician who worked at the Dahlgren Naval Base from 1956 for 40 years, and she helped develop the technology behind the global positioning system. So again, next time you use your navigational device, thank Gladys West. She's really kind of a hidden figure of GPS, one of the many Black women who worked in the naval and defense industries, NASA and so forth, helping to develop technologies that have transformed our modern world, but have not been acknowledged until relatively recently. And I love Gladys West's story because it's such an inspirational one. She was from a rural family in Dinwiddie County, and she knew that her standard lot in life was likely going to be either working in the fields picking tobacco or working in a factory processing tobacco. She didn't want that life for herself, and she saw education as her path out of that life. So she worked very hard in school to graduate as valedictorian of her class. And that top spot earned her a scholarship to Virginia State University, which then launched her onto her career as a mathematician. A couple of the items we have related to Gladys West's career. We have some of the books she used over the course of her studies and her career, calculus books and whatnot. And then we also have this report she authored in 1981 that has to do with satellite measurements of the Earth, the way that satellites were used to map the surface of the Earth. And that's part of the technology that helped inform global positioning system. I, as a historian, don't understand anything beyond that. I just know that it was Gladys West's calculations and her work that's represented in reports like this that helped us develop GPS. Part of the mission of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is to represent the stories of all Virginians. And to that end, we have made a concerted effort to build our holdings of collections related to African history. And there is a section of the Determined exhibition that features some of our recent acquisitions in Black history. One of the largest and most impressive items is the Blackwell family tree. This is a large family tree drawn on canvas. The canvas measures about 9 feet by 11 feet, and it traces multiple generations of the Blackwell family. This is a family that traces its roots to present-day Senegal in Africa, and to 2 women, a mother and daughter, Tab and Amar, or Amma is the name it's sometimes spelled. These 2 women were kidnapped, captured, brought to Virginia as part of the international slave trade. They were sold to a planter in Yorktown in 1735. And these women are the ancestors of what became a large family of more than 5,000 descendants that are now spread across the globe. Among the descendants of the Blackwell family include the tennis great and humanitarian Arthur Ashe Jr., and he is featured on this branch of the tree.